Welcome students. In the last module, we saw the role of the UN General Assembly with regard to the protection and promotion of human rights. In this module, we will take up the role of the UN Security Council with regard to the protection and promotion of human rights. As you know, under the UN Charter, 6 principal organs have been established, which include the Security Council, and it consists of 5 permanent members, and which are China, France, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. And in addition, there are 10 non-permanent members who are elected for a period of 2 years, and it is based in the UN headquarters at New York. And if you look at the charter, it spells out the mandate of the UN Security Council. Under Article 25, there is a clear mention about the responsibility of the states to accept and carry out the decisions of the UN Security Council. To this extent, it differs from other principal organs which can only make recommendations to the member states, and here contrary to the other principal organs, the UN Security Council's decisions require action by the member states, and the UN Security Council has the primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security under Article 24(1) of the UN Charter, and its powers have been mentioned in Chapter 7. And if you look at Article 39 of the UN Charter, it says that the UN Security Council shall determine whether there exists a threat to the peace or a breach of the peace or aggression, and shall make recommendation and shall take decisions to restore peace and normalcy. As you know, Article 1 of the UN Charter talks about the purposes of the United Nations. The first purpose is to promote international peace and security, and so here the UN Security Council has the primary or a principal responsibility to maintain international peace and security. When a complaint is brought to the UN Security Council, what does it do? In fact, initially it tries to reach an agreement by peaceful means, and so that it can do so by passing resolutions or outlining the contours of such a peaceful agreement, or through other measures. In case these attempts to reach an agreement through peaceful means fail, and in case hostilities break out, the UN Security Council can make decisions asking for ceasefire, or depute military observers to the conflict prone areas, or send peacekeeping forces. And in case the hostilities still do not end, there are certain enforcement measures which are provided under the UN Charter under Chapter 7. For instance, Article 41 of the UN Charter requires United Nations Security Council to impose economic sanctions. For instance, way back in the year 1966, the UN Security Council imposed economic sanctions against southern Rhodesia, and in addition to these economic sanctions, it can also impose arms embargo. It was used in 1977 against Southern Africa, South Africa. And so the enforcement measures also include levy of financial penalties, financial sanctions, or imposition of travel bans, or severing diplomatic relations, or imposing blockade, or if you see under Article 42 of the Chapter 7, there is a clear mention about using collective military action. In a sense, this is what you call the powers and also the mandate of the United Nations Security Council, and it uses a variety of tools to further its mandate. Sometimes it has used the commissions of inquiry, or it has also used judicial mechanisms. It has used visiting missions or sanction to advance its goals or its mandate. Now, let's look up some resolutions which have a great relevance to the human rights. For instance, when Gulf War broke out or when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the UN Security Council found a threat to the international peace and security and passed a resolution asking member states to take action and for restoration of the international peace and security. Further down, when it found that there was a threat of repression of Iraqi citizens and Kurds, it passed another important resolution asking all member states to take collective action to ensure that the human rights of the Iraqi citizens and Kurds were protected. In Somalia, a very important landmark intervention took place. In the light of the serious conflict situation in Somalia, breakdown of the law and order machinery or the state machinery, the UN found a threat to the international peace and security and authorized use of force to restore peace and security in Somalia. It is regarded as a landmark resolution in the history of the United Nations Security Council. Further down, if you look at there have been other resolutions. In Haiti, for instance, there was a military rule, there was a replacement of the legitimately elected government, and the UN Security Council found that the situation in Haiti represented a threat to the international peace and security and authorized use of a joint force by the member states in order to restore it back to normalcy. This, as you know, conflict involves human rights violation. It is the outcome of a human rights violations over a protracted period of time, and there are violations within a conflict. So to that extent, the UN Security Council by restoring peace and security advances human rights. Now let us turn our attention to terrorism. As you know, terrorism is a serious violation of human rights. The killing are other acts which are carried out to instill fear among the general public, among the countries, itself is a serious violation of human rights. After the 9/11 bombing of the Trade Towers in New York, the UN Security Council came out with a series of resolutions asking member states to take action to effectively handle the challenge posed by terrorism. While terrorism on the one hand is a serious human rights violations, at times the countermeasures taken by the member states in order to handle this threat of terrorism can also lead to further violations. So, this UN Security Council passed two landmark resolutions asking the member states to respect international human rights law, international humanitarian law and refugee law while carrying out their obligations to eliminate the threat of international terrorism. So, in other words, the states do not have an unlimited amplitude to eliminate terrorism, and the efforts that they take have to be circumscribed within the limits of international human rights or humanitarian or refugee law. Now, let us turn our attention to the International Criminal Court. As you know, Rome Statute was adopted in the year 1998 and to address 4 serious crimes. These are such serious crimes which shock the conscience of the mankind. They include genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and the crime of aggression. After ratification by a certain number of states, the Rome Statute came into force in the year 2002, and it's based, the International Criminal Court is based in The Hague, so it's a first permanent court. And before that, there is a history. For instance, in 1993, in the wake of ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia, the UN Security Council summoned its collective will and established an ad hoc international military tribunal to try all violations of the international human rights and humanitarian law. And in the subsequent year, there was a genocide in the Rwanda in Africa, and again the UN Security Council established an ad hoc international military tribunal for Rwanda to try these serious war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. Now, these two ad hoc international tribunals have space and temporal limitations, in the sense that they can look at violations during a particular period of time or during or in a particular geographical location. In other words, there was a need felt for a permanent international court, and that's how the Rome Statute was adopted in the year 1998, and it is there is a permanent court which exists and which can try out these serious crimes. And how is it relevant to the UN Security Council? Now, there are 3 ways in which the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction can be triggered. One is, a state party to the Rome Statute can refer a situation happening in its country to the International Criminal Court. Secondly, the UN Security Council can refer a particular situation to the ICC. Thirdly, the proprio moto powers of the prosecutor, whereby the prosecutor, based on some reliable information, can take a certain situation, start investigation after authorization by a pre-trial chamber. So, out of these 3 triggers for the launching of an investigation by the International Criminal Court, there is a role provided for the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council can not only refer a situation, in fact, it did refer the situation in Darfur region in Sudan and also in Libya to the UN, to the International Criminal Court, and it can also defer an existing investigation for a period of 1 year, which can be extendable by an year by year. So, in other words, the there is a international criminal court which can try very serious crimes or egregious crimes, or and in that there is a role provided for the UN Security Council. When a UN Security Council refers a situation to the ICC, it does not matter whether that country has signed and ratified the Rome Statute. And now, initially in the Rome Statute, the crimes of genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity have been defined, but the crime of aggression was left to a later conference of the states parties. That's how in the year 2010, the Assembly of States Parties meeting in Kampala adopted a definition of the crime of aggression, and also determined the conditions under which the ICC's jurisdiction can be invoked. But some of it they have left it to the subsequent conference after January 2017, and that's how in the December 2017 there was a further conference that was held, and it was decided that the ICC's jurisdiction with regard to the serious crime of aggression shall be activated, in fact from July 2018. So, in fact, there again the UN Security Council has a major role in determining that there is a breach of peace or that the crime of aggression has indeed occurred. Now, this in substance is the role of the UN Security Council in advancing the human rights across the world, as mentioned in the United Nations Charter. Now let us take up a critique of the UN Security Council's efforts. For instance, it's often alleged that it's not a representative body. At times there are conflicts, but there is an inactivity on the part of the UN Security Council to squarely address it. At times there are allegations of selectivity as well. Now, it all relates to the composition of the UN Security Council. Often, the veto power of the 5 permanent members, or P5, is it hampers the ability of the UN Security Council to act freely and either to block a particular move or to authorize a particular move. At times the veto power is used by the P5 members. Of course, there are demands that the UN Security Council should become a more democratic, more representative force and more representative body by taking into its fold the countries that really wield security or economic and other power, and hopefully in the years to come the Security Council should become a more representative body and advance all the principles, all the purposes of the United Nations, including protection of human rights